And welcome, everybody, to Krown Gridiron Nation on TSN, brought to you by Krown Produce and by PointsBet. There is Mike in Toronto. He's keeping warm. Gord is not keeping warm in Vancouver, but I am on Football Island, and we're ready to bring you the 2-minute offense. SEC Championship, number 3 Alabama versus number 1 Georgia. The Tide were a touchdown underdog, but don't tell that to John Metchie III. Metchi on fire in the first half. 6 receptions, 97 yards, and a touchdown. But that fire was snuffed out in the dying minutes of the first half. Metchi sustaining a season-ending knee injury. He still hung around to see some points scored, but will he hang around next season and recover? We will talk about that in a moment. The Pitt Panthers and Jarrett Wayne versus Wake Forest and Luigi Villain. Which Canadian would come out on top? Well, Jarrett Wayne threw his way and caught his way to an ACC championship win. Both these guys had big games. You know where we'll be talking about them in just a couple of minutes. To the Mountain West Championship we go. Utah State over San Diego State by a comfortable margin, but a guy we've wanted to talk about all year long is Daniel Okpoko out of Saskatoon. He had a couple of stops in this one, and it wouldn't be enough for the Mountain West Championship. AAC Championship, Cincinnati over Houston, 35-20. This is the final non-bowl game for senior Olivier Charles Pierre from Laval, Quebec. He had a pair of stops in this one. FCS playoffs, second round. It was Keelan White's Montana Grizzlies over Nolan Alves, Eastern Washington Eagles in a battle of BC receivers. White with his first playoff reception. He now has 22 catches on the year. So, have we seen the last of John Metchie III in Crimson? The defending Cornish Trophy winner is done for the year after this knee injury in the SEC Championship game. What are his options now, Gord?
Yeah, it's an interesting question as to whether we've seen the last of him at Alabama or not. I think it's probably more common for players in this situation to take this injury as a sign that, hey, I better get paid while I can and make sure that I take care of myself and my family. And get paid while you're rehabbing from that injury. So I know that a lot of guys tend to lean in that direction. The other interesting possibility, though, is that he had a fairly good chance of sneaking into the back end of the first round in next spring's draft with the way that he is performing this year. That's unlikely to happen now since he probably won't be ready for the start of the NFL season next year, or it'll be a push if he is. So the other possibility is maybe he takes that dropping draft stock as a reason to go back to Alabama, stay there and rehab with the medical training staff that he's used to working with at Bama in a comfortable environment, and then focus on getting himself into what should be a first-round draft pick the following year if he does decide to come back.
I see this as kind of being a little bit like the Chuba Hubbard situation where we talked after his junior year and it was, should he go back and go for another big year at Oklahoma State or should he go for the pros? And I thought he should have gone for the pros, and I'll say the same thing for Metchie, and the reason being there's no guarantee that he's going to see the same amount of footballs next year that he did this year. He's still a great talent. That's not going away. But this year, Alabama almost became too reliant on him, which sounds odd, but with the amount of people that they've recruited over the last couple of years in terms of receivers, I would get out of there now. And I agree that maybe the knee injury is going to concern some people, but I think you look long-term, and as long as he goes through the combine process and looks fine, or even is healing at a really good pace, I think you're going to look at Metchie as being a guy who is a late first, early second, no matter what the status is, because the talent is there. And I would be surprised, frankly, and I think it might be a bad decision if he were going to go back to Alabama.
Something a little bit old, something a little bit new coming up in our Stateside 5. In at 5, Saskatoon sophomore Daniel Okpoko, part of San Diego State's run to the Mountain West Championship game, finishes his last 3 starts with 3 tackles, 3 assists, and a quarterback hurry. North Vancouver's Keelan White is the lone Canadian survivor in FCS playoffs. Scores his first playoff catch, has 21 on the year as Montana moves to round 3. It's stateside 5 favorite Luigi Villain, the Toronto Argonauts draft pick, with 3 tackles and 2 sacks in the ACC championship game for Wake Forest. The winner of that game was Pitt, and one of the leaders on the field, Peterborough's Jared Wayne. He completed a pass, and he did his core stuff too. 3 receptions, 48 yards, and a tutty. And finally, in at 1, once again, it is John Metchie III in 1 half. 6 receptions, 97 yards, and a TD in a ginormous upset in the SEC championship over previously ranked number 1 Georgia. Coming up, we have the champions, my friend. Welcome back, everyone. It took a little more than 2 years, but finally we have a national champion in Canada. Let's recap it in our 3-minute warning. It's a rematch of the first Vanier that went to overtime way back in 1994. Western over Saskatchewan. That was indoors at the Sky Dome. This is -9 in St. Foy, Quebec at kickoff. And it's the Mustangs who engineer an impressive 5-play, 70-yard drive, capped by Trey Humes romping 25 yards to the promised land. But the Huskies would settle down and settle in. A field goal, then a Daniel Perry 22-yard catch from Mason Nyhouse would put the Dogs on top. 12-10 Sasky at the half. But the second half is when rookie quarterback Evan Hillock got rolling. He connects with Griffin Campbell and turns 50 yards into 6. Then he finds Campbell again to close out the third, and it is 24-14 Ponies. It's 27-14. There's still some bite left in Saskatchewan. Joshua Ncaa plunges in from 1 yard out. The margin is 6. Not a lot of time left on the clock, and the short kick doesn't work. And the Western Mustangs are your Vanier Cup champions for the 8th time in program history. Entertainment-wise, it was good to a very good championship game in Quebec City. And at the end of the day, the best team won, Mike.
Yeah, and it kind of went following the script, which in Canadian football playoffs, whether it be at the amateur or pro level, sometimes doesn't happen. But we saw, despite the really bad footing, on a couple of occasions, certainly with big runs, Western did what we expected them to do. At least once or twice, we expected the offensive line to just create that gargantuan hole that one of the 3 running backs was able to scoot through, and we saw that with Western. Although, it was a passing game that maybe opened up by that offensive line that provided to be sort of the finishing blows for the Mustangs. So yeah, it really didn't surprise me that the look wasn't great because of the condition of the field, watching guys slip and slide around, especially in the first half. But I think everybody here kind of looked at maybe not Gord because he was riding Saskatchewan pretty hard, but Jimmy and I had Western by about a touchdown. So I think, maybe a little lower scoring than we had thought, but still a very entertaining football game with enough big plays to go around. And yes, in this case, I do think the better team won.
Yeah, and Western reminded us of something that we've talked about on this program in previous years, and it's the fact that their rushing attack on offense is not just about the offensive line. It really is a whole team rushing scheme. And evidence was that first touchdown that they scored, Trey Humes getting sprung by, I believe it was Brett Ellerman, but one of the receivers or backs adding on to the backside of the formation and washing the Huskies defensive end right out of the play. And that springs Humes for a touchdown. These are the kinds of things that you see from Western year after year. They're one of the few teams that regularly runs an H-back on almost every snap, and they've usually got a big receiver or two to add into the run formation as well. They were able to add that in and run effectively. Again, despite the footing, like you said, Mike. The 2 best units on the field, I would say, though, were the 2 Western lines. And this is where I thought the Saskatchewan was maybe going to have a bit of an edge and maybe be able to turn the tide and win things, is that they had a veteran and a talented group on both sides of the ball in their trenches. And on both sides of the ball, Western's guys pushed them around. The offensive line kept Hillock clean all day, wasn't sacked once. And the defensive line, guys, Deontay Knight looks like a superstar. I'm hoping to watch him for years to come. He looks great, and that whole unit just did not allow Saskatchewan to get the push and establish the run consistently the way that they really needed to be successful here too. So, full credit to them, and it was really a thorough effort from Western. Felt like in the first half, the only thing that really held them up was the weather, and once they figured it out, it was kind of curtains from there. So full credit to the champs.
It was a U Sports season with no major disruptions due to COVID. That's from partly good planning and a minor miracle. And it had more than its share of surprises. So how do you wrap up what was a challenging restart for all 27 teams?
Well, I'd say some of the storylines coming out of it is there's a possible changing of the guard at the top of the C-Dub, and I know the guys at Calgary probably aren't going to want to hear this, but that's now the last 2 seasons in U Sports that Saskatchewan's come out of that conference, and it appears that they may be the ones to gun for now instead of the Calgary Dinos in that conference. In the OUA, I think one of the headlines from my perspective was that generally speaking, it looks better split. I know all the programs in the OUA West will probably disagree with that notion, but it looks better as 2 relatively equal-sized conferences compared to the other ones, rather than one monster conference like they usually are. And then the other big one, and this is unfortunately the looming specter over U Sports football right now, is the gap with the AUS compared to the other conferences is growing. It's bigger than ever, and it's not showing any signs of slowing down. And I think every time that they step on a national television and get pumped by 50-plus points in a national semifinal makes that gap even bigger. So those are a few things that, for better or for worse, came out of this season for me.
I think we got a lot of star power as well. And, the machine that we saw in Calgary, the Philpots, I don't think disappointed anybody. We saw Nius in Saskatchewan come up and maybe take some people off guard, and Mackert as well. They're really good players. The Trey Ford show was the Trey Ford show in Ontario, and I was a little surprised, honestly. Maybe the Crichton was more of a crowning of his career rather than a one-season achievement. But that kid deserved to have his name on that trophy at some point. We saw the emergence of Waugh at Concordia, and again, like Gordy says, I'm just hoping, everybody is hoping that the AUS can take its game to the next level. It's been way too long since we've seen a team be really competitive out of there, and I don't want to kick a conference when it's down, but that's the one thing that I think really we need to see more than anything else.
Coming up, we got punters, we got kickers, we got returners, we got goats. 113th Canadian Bowl in London, Ontario. One of these teams would win their first national championship. First quarter, after a London stop, the Rams would run a direct snap to Kyle Claridge on 3rd down. It would lead to a Langley field goal. Next possession, quarterback Michael Calvert connects with David Osho for a 36-yard gain, but once again would only result in 3. 6-0 Langley. Langley had some offensive issues in the first half. Devin Smith with an INT for the Beefs, and then next drive, a fumble, and Cody Roberts recovers. London would give up 4 safeties, but no TDs, and it was 14-0 at half. But in the third, this is the play that would break it open. Daniel Kabongo, 2 moves, and then he launches all the way to the promised land. 23-0 Langley. Defense is what got it done for the Rams. Tyler Eckert with one of his 10 sacks. Your final, 37-0 Langley Rams. They are your CJFL champions. PointsBet Canadian Goat Time. Our friends at PointsBet have teamed up with the KGN crew to present the PointsBet Canadian Goat Search for the top college position players of all time. As usual, we break it down into 3 eras and by position group. This week, it is special teams. Mike, let's start with you. You got a lot to pick from. Who are your 3 picks from the 3 eras with potential GOAT special teams players based on their college careers?
Well, let's go to the Wayback Machine first. And I've learned one thing covering football over the years, that every punter thinks he can play quarterback. Every quarterback thinks he can punt. But few can do both, and Bob Cameron was one of those guys at Acadia who could do both and do things exceptionally well. And, not only was he a star at a really, really good Acadia team in the late 70s, he went on to star in the Canadian Football League, and I think he played 84 or 85 years with the Blue Bombers. He was just around so long and just punted at such a high level. And especially at the pros. He just redefined how to kick into the wind out there. Middle group for me is maybe the easiest one of all because, I know Gord is probably on the same page to a degree. I'm the captain of the Jimmy Allen fan club. Watching him play at Queens, he was a guy that had a unique skill where, he would run into a pile of players who were down on coverage, and somehow the pile would be there, but Jimmy Allen would have found a way out of it. He was just so electrifying as a returner for the Gales, and to me, that's an easy one. And for the latest players, how good was this guy? He's now a member of the Ticats, and this Argo employee is picking him. But Tunde Adeleke at Carleton, he was part of that early year resurgence of the Ravens. Players like himself and Nate Bahar just really took that franchise to a new high very quickly. And, Adeleke was another guy who could do it two ways, not only as a defensive back, but as a returner. You just waited to see a missed field goal. You waited to see a punt that went between the hash marks where he was going to have extra lanes to choose from. He was just so electric at that level. And, it was easier to say this when he was out in Calgary. I'd like to see him get a chance to return some at the pro level. He's just a really special guy and really was at that level. So those would be my three goats.
Going back to the in the Wayback Machine, I'm going to pick probably the greatest Canadian kicker ever in Louis Pasaglia, the local legend out here in BC. Grows up in Vancouver, goes to Simon Fraser, has a decorated college career, and then of course the lengthy 25-plus year career with the BC Lions. What more can you say from that guy with one of the most iconic moments in Canadian football history in his winning kick in the 94 Grey Cup, excuse me. Then in my second group, Mike, you were talking about the quarterback who thinks he can punt and the punter who thinks he can play quarterback. Well, my guy's one of those guys too, and that's Mitch Berger, another local guy from out here out west. Provincial champion, provincial all-star quarterback at North Delta High. He goes down to JUCO in Texas and starts kicking. He continues that on to Colorado, has a great career kicking in the Big 12, and then a lengthy pro career that was successful as well. A great all-around career for the local guy here. And then my most recent bracket, I'm going to go with Johnny Mark, the all-time points scored leader in USPORTS history. This guy had 2 of the top 20 scoring seasons by an individual player in USPORTS history himself. The kicker from Ontario comes out to Calgary, has a decorated 4-year career there. Clearly, I would say the greatest USPORTS kicker from an era of great USPORTS kickers like himself, Harulahu, Krapina, all those guys that were in the 2000s that did great stuff. Johnny Mark stood out above them all.
Now, I find myself in the strange role of agreeing with these guys. So I'm going to throw one different guy into the mix, and that's in the next gen era with Jamie Borum. Here was a guy that played with 3 CIS teams and went back to junior 3 times. But he's an all-Canadian in 3 positions, punter, kicker, and free safety, and was an all-Canadian a couple of times. He shattered team and conference records back in the day and blew his ACL out in his final year in his second game and then played the rest of the season. Jamie Borum might be my GOAT for that reason alone. In the foundational group, 2 Hall of Famers, Bob Cameron from Acadia and Lou from SFU. In the next gen section, it's a battle of kickers, Mitch Berger from Colorado State, and then 10 years later, Jamie Borum from various teams. And finally, in the now category, Jimmy Allen from Queens, Johnny Mark, the USPORTS all-time points leader, and Tunde Adeleke, who graduated in 2016. So next week, we're going to give you our PointsBet GOAT teams. One team is from you, from your Twitter vote, and the other team's from us, because we're supposedly the experts. So you're going to want to tune in next week to see your PointsBet Canadian GOAT teams. Coming up, speaking of experts, it is picks from the experts. Okay, NCAA picks, or should I say just pick, singular, because it's only Army-Navy this week. And I should add, it is the favorite game on the calendar every year for Mr. Krown Produce. So you get this right, and you'll have a wonderful fruit basket on your doorstep Sunday morning, Gord.
Oh, hopefully there's a big fat check in it too. It's a big gap between the two teams in this year's game. Usually they have fairly similar records, but it's a pretty significant gap. Army comes in at 8-3, Navy at 3-8. But guys, usually when I'm picking this game, I'm doing it based on who I think has the better uniforms in any given year's matchup. So this year I'm going to go to Navy to cover it. And I do have a few other reasons why I think Navy's going to cover the spread, which as of right now is sitting at just over a touchdown. One of the reasons for that is quite simply that I expect it's going to look much like it does behind me here in this upcoming weekend, and typically that makes for a low-scoring matchup in this game and a tight matchup in this game. You know, Army still very run-heavy, as is Navy. The clock will move fast. There's not going to necessarily be a lot of opportunity unless you see a ton of big plays for big scores to be run up. So I think that all bodes well for Navy to keep this one close within a full score. So I'm going to go with Navy plus the 7.5 as I'm looking at it right now.
The spectacle of this game will probably be better than the game itself. As you mentioned, the bad conditions. Yeah, I tend to go the opposite of Gord here, because when you look at two teams with disparaging records like this and pretty one-sided, in a game like this, even though it's almost a touchdown, I just have to favor the better team. And Army is by far the better team this year, so I'll take Army and give the points and expect my fruit basket in Whitby and by Tuesday morning.
Everybody knows by now this is a college show, but we'd be remiss not to chime in on the Grey Cup coming up this weekend. And as the old saying goes, you can't win without great Canadian talent in the CFL. And both Winnipeg and Hamilton have some standouts. With the Argos eliminated, Mike is free to opine on this one. Who do you have and why, Mike?
Who do you think? You want the Argo guy to pick the Ticats? Hell has not frozen over, although from the looks of Gord, it's pretty close. But I've got to go with Winnipeg. I mean, it's 2 years in a row, 2 seasons in a row, I guess, they're going to have met for the Grey Cup, and Winnipeg just seems to have something special going again this year. It's two of my absolute favorite people in the history of the Canadian Football League, and my affiliation with them, and Mike O'Shea and Orlando Steinauer as head coaches. And sorry, Coach O, got to go with O'Shea on this one. We'll go Winnipeg.
I'm going to go the other direction because that's, I believe, my job on this show, but I'm going to pick the Hamilton Ticats. And a couple of reasons why I like this largely boil down to narrative for me, but the one is that, when Winnipeg won 2 seasons ago, they broke the league's longest championship drought. Well, the league's current longest championship drought belongs to the Hamilton Ticats. So I think breaking both those 2 in consecutive Grey Cups would be a cool little side story. And then the other one for me, I love Brandon Revenberg. He's probably my favorite Canadian offensive lineman in the league. So when you're talking about impact Canadian talent, I love the way that guy plays. I would love to see him wear a ring. He's been one of the best in the league since he entered the league, really. And then the other guy that we talked about earlier on the show that I would love to see with a ring in his hands, who's never missed a Grey Cup in his career, I should add, is Tunde Adeleke on the Tiger Cats. So those are 2 guys that are driving my pick in that direction.
So for everyone on Krown Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullen saying, let's get out to the game, also known as the Grey Cup.